Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm a farmer in Eastern Ontario. I farm with my parents and my husband, and we are egg farmers. So we have laying hens, 19,000 of them, and they live in this barn here. And we also grow crops on our farm. And we also have a shop that you can see over here. And my husband works on our own equipment there and also fixes up equipment for a few of our neighbors as well. I also work off the farm as well, part-time, and I work as an agronomist. An agronomist is basically someone who helps manage farmers' crop. So I help farmers through the winter with a planning process and then help them make decisions as they're into planting and as the crop is growing through the year, and then into harvest. And then we do soil sampling so we can find out what's in the soil in terms of nutrients for what is needed for the next crop. And then we go into the winter and start the planning process all over again. So I went to the University of Guelph and I'm now a certified crop advisor. And so that's kind of what led me into agronomy and to be part-time as an agronomist. So like I mentioned, on our farm, we grow crops, and the crops that we grow are corn, soybeans, and wheat. And so if you look behind me, you can actually see these are two of the crops that we grow. So this is a field of soybeans and this is a field of corn. And so on our farm, like most farms in Ontario, we use something called crop rotation. And crop rotation is just basically means that you don't grow the same crop on the same field over and over and over again. So this field behind me, that's soybeans. Last year, this field was in corn. And then this field of corn over to my other side, last year, this field was soybeans. And so I said earlier too that we do also grow wheat, but it's only on about a quarter of our acres. And so the wheat is in that rotation as well too. And so oftentimes we'll have our corn is planted after the wheat. And so that'll be in there too. But sometimes some of our acres are just corn after soybeans or soybeans after corn. And the main reason that farmers use crop rotation is because it's really good for the soil and it's really good for the crops. So having a different crop on the soil each year or on a field each year helps build the biodiversity, because the more different things that you have growing in a field, the more biodiversity you're going to have in that soil, and the more good bugs or microorganisms that you're going to have as well. Having crop rotation also helps with things like pest control, so diseases and insects. If you're not growing the same crop year after year, you're going to have less issues with that. And it also helps boost the yields of your crop. So it's really just a really important tool that farmers have to use in order to make sure that they're getting better crops. And so at this time of year, so the crop's in the ground, everything's growing. We've fortunately been really lucky this year. We've had some decent rains. And so at this time of year, the main thing that we're doing is scouting our fields. And so scouting is basically just, we go into the fields and we look at what's happening with the crop. So farming is extremely dependent on the weather. So every year, depending what the weather's doing, because it's so different from year to year, that can really change what we're seeing in our crop. So that's why it's so important for us to look at least kind of one time in the year, but go multiple times and look at our fields so that we know what's happening. And so for the last 2 weeks, I've actually been scouting our fields or looking at our fields for an insect called soybean aphid. And that seems to be a problem in our area this year. And so it's something that I've been looking for. And so soybean aphids are basically, they're an issue in the soybeans because what they'll do is they will basically suck the sugars and the juices out of the plant that the plant would use to make the soybeans, to make the seed. And it can suck those juices out, and then it can really damage the plant. And so it would really take away from what the plant will yield. And so when we are looking for soybean aphids, or really looking for any pests, there are things called thresholds or certain levels that the pest has to get to in order to have us use a control method or a pesticide. And so these levels have been developed by entomologists, or basically insect scientists, and they've been developed by crop specialists and research trials over many years and have a lot of data, so that as farmers we know what level those soybean aphids or whatever pests we're looking for has to get to in order for us to use some sort of pesticide to control them. So it's a good process so that we're not just unnecessarily putting pesticides on our crops. We're only using them if absolutely necessary. And we've been really lucky so far. So the field behind me has actually been so far been below the threshold levels of soybean aphid, and so we've been lucky and we haven't had to spray. And so like I said too, like we're really dependent on weather. So in corn at this time of year, we're still also scouting corn as well. We're looking at this point for diseases and for insects as well. And this is also a very important time weather-wise for the corn. So you can see behind me that the corn is starting to tassel. And so tassel, you can see up here, that's a tassel on a corn plant. And so that's where all of the pollen is on the corn plant. And so it's important at this time of year for there to be enough moisture because we need the tasseling and the pollination process needs that moisture. So the pollen from up here on the plant will fall down below onto what's called a silk. And so this silk, you can see that's where the cob will form from that. And so the pollen falls onto these silks, and each silk has the potential to become a kernel on your cob of corn. And so we need moisture to make sure that these silks stay moist in order that when the pollen falls on them, they can pollinate properly and you'll get a well-formed cob that will have all of these kernels. If they dried out too much, then you'd only have about half a cob because not everything would pollinate. And so we want lots of moisture around this time. And so again, it's another process of farming that is very dependent on the weather. So it's very important that we're monitoring our crops at this time of year so that if there is something we can do to help mitigate weather or, for example, pests like the soybean aphids, we're monitoring our crops so that we know if we need to do something about that. So I also mentioned that we also grow wheat on our farm. And so at this time of year, the wheat is just getting ready to harvest. So that means that the kernels are dried down and they're ripe and it's getting ready to harvest. So that means that we're at this point, we're getting our combine ready. So this behind me is our combine. And our combine is what we use to harvest all of our crops. And so you can see here, there's a head on it, and this head is called a flex head. It's what we use when we're harvesting wheat or when we're harvesting soybeans. And then we have a different head that we put on the combine when we're harvesting corn. And so what happens when you harvest is the combine basically drives through the field and there's knives in this head and it cuts the crop off and then it puts the crop into the combine. And it goes through here and has a process which is called thrashing. Basically, there's just a bunch of belts and conveyors and sieves that kind of separate the grain or the kernels of wheat that we want to keep from the chaff or from the straw, the rest of the plant. And so all of the grain that we has, or the seeds of the wheat, go up into this big bin, and all of the rest of it, so the straw in the case of wheat, comes out the back and goes back onto the field. And so in the case of wheat, most farmers will harvest the straw, and it's usually put into bales, what we call bales, so it's just kind of tied together in blocks. And then those bales and that straw is used mostly for animal bedding or for feed. And so it's a very important process at this time with the wheat and the harvest. And then we also use, when you're in the process, or when you're harvesting corn and soybeans, what we do is what comes out the back, it's not straw. We more refer to it as residue, because normally this residue or the rest of the plant is left on the field. And so there's lots of nutrients and that are in that residue. And so it's good that it goes back into the field so that we're not having to put as much fertilizer on, because we're not taking as many nutrients away from the soil. And having those, the rest of the plant go back onto the field also helps build and keep the organic matter in the field so that we can keep our soils in good shape. And it also helps prevent any kind of erosion, whether it's wind or water erosion. It prevents that from happening. So it's really important that we keep that residue going back in our field. So it's good that it's important that we have it coming back out the combine and onto the field. So that's kind of just what's going on our farm right now. I hope you guys learned a little bit at least, and thanks very much for listening.